Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. So engagers, welcome once again to Professor Game Podcast. And today we have somebody very, very special, a guest as usual. When this guest is called Kristen. But Kristen, before we get started, we need to know, are you prepared to engage?
I am indeed.
Let's do this because Kristen Toohill believes that games are powerful tools for organizational development. She writes books that use interactivity and immersion of games to solve issues that face organizations today, such as reducing unconscious bias and learning 21st century human skills. She has also worked in the video game industry as a quality assurance tester and scrum master on a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. And she has also done organizational development and games work for Green Tree Games and Revelian. Revelian, is that the way to pronounce it?
Yes, indeed. A lovely Australian company.
Australian company, there you go. And she has also performed qualitative research within the technological, mining, and comic book industry. So many interesting things to talk about today. Is there anything that we're missing from that intro, Kristen?
I am also a doctoral student at the moment.
Very interesting. Is that a PhD or is it a different type of doctoral studies?
It is a PsyD, so it is an applied psychological degree.
Ooh, nice. Very, very interesting. We'll probably get into some of that knowledge during the interview as well. And we'd like to know, getting into that regular life that you have, what does it feel like? What does a regular day with Kristen look like?
Yeah, so I find that I don't necessarily have any regular days. However, my weeks tend to fall into cadence. So I, again, am a student. So I'm doing my readings, listening to the lectures, and I post on a discussion board regularly. It is an online degree. I am also a teacher's assistant and a tutor. And I try and keep myself healthy by working out a little bit every day. And I actually use both yoga and a game for that. And I also...
Which game?
Ring Fit Adventure. I love it. And I also like to take on extra projects to connect my degree, which is in organizational development and leadership psychology, to my love and passion for games.
That sounds absolutely fantastic. And we want to dive right into the questions here. And there's a question we like very much because of what we can learn from it. And that question has to do with failure or fail, those first attempts in learning. So we'd like to know if you have a story that you can tell us about a time when you set out to do something with games or gamification or something similar. And actually, the results were not what you expected. You had this first attempt in learning. And of course, we want to be there with you. We want to live that story with you. And what did you learn? How did you come out of it?
Of course. So I have a nice big failure that I learned a ton from. So I actually ran my own independent game studio for about a year while I was getting my master's. And I gave myself a year to either make it or not. And as I'm sure that you know, about 75% of all new ventures fail or close in the first 2 years. And that was me. We made about 2 to 3 different game prototypes, which I'm definitely very proud of, but none of them really took off. And part of why they didn't, and the big learning that I took away from that, was the importance of contracting with your team and checking in, and not necessarily having a legal contract. That's not what I mean, but stating what your expectations are, what you need, and then having everyone else say what their expectations are and what they need, and just making sure that you're all on the same page. And of course, especially in starting a new small business, things are going to change a whole lot. So acknowledging openly when things change and when your needs and wants change early instead of letting problems build up.
Those are very, very important things. And aligning people on the same page, as you said from the start, is super, super important. Is there any, I know I don't want you to hurt anybody's feelings or anything, but is there any specific example or something that doesn't have to be personally identifiable or anything, but a close example of something that happened, or one of the things, maybe a quick story of something that happened during that time that you would say, this was something that I definitely did and I wouldn't do, or something that actually help me get out of that situation?
hmm So I just found out sort of slowly and over time, and by looking at other people's actions, that they were super interested in making game prototypes, but they weren't necessarily interested in treating this non-paying game studio thing as a full-time job like I was. So we were just coming at it from very different perspectives, from the perspective of a hobby and the perspective of a job, and both of which are completely valid, completely fine, beautiful ways to come at it. But if you have two people coming at it from those very different perspectives and thinking that the other one's treating it the same way, then you can start to have a few problems.
Sounds like it. Definitely. Definitely. So again, it has to do with, as you were saying, expectations and what do you want to make of it? And there's people listening to this podcast who are sometimes asking or looking at things like, well, I'm starting in this career in game-based solutions or gamification or even educational games or something similar. And it's a crucial point when what you were saying. It's a question that we have to make ourselves. Are you treating it as a hobby, as a side business? How much of your time is going to be invested into that? If it's a side business, if it's a full-time project, if you're leaving everything behind, how do you make sure everybody else is on the same page or that it's something compatible? Because you don't all have to be in that same situation necessarily, but it has to be somehow compatible and it has to be clear. Like who's putting more, risk, so to speak, on the table, how much time you're going to dedicate in that consequence, how much time other people are not going to dedicate as well. So those are very, very crucial questions. And I think it's a very key learning point, even if it's not directly related to, the psychology behind games or all these things that are behind that. I do think it's a super valuable lesson for our careers in these kinds of situations. So thank you very much, Kristen, for that story.
Of course.
Kristen, now we want to take a 180-degree spin. Is there a story of course, something you set out to do with games, or the psychology of games or game-based solutions that you set out to do that and you actually had success? Again, on the first, second, or 10th try that you did it, we want to be there with you. We want to go through that story and understand maybe some of the key points that led you into such a success. Can you tell us such a story?
Yeah, so I'm actually incredibly excited and happy because myself and my co-author, Scott Crabtree, just finished writing a book called All Work and Some Play, subtitled Future Proof Your Career Through Games.
Past guest, Scott Crabtree. Yes, indeed.
Yes, indeed. And he even alluded to the book, and it is done, and we are proofing it, and it will be out soon. So that was a situation where we were both writing about games and using a lot of our knowledge from making games to write the book. So one thing that I love about games is the fact that they give really quick feedback and can have very fast iteration cycles. So we kind of used that idea in making the book, where I would write a bit and then send it to Scott, and then he would write a bit and send it to me, and just go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until we had something that we were incredibly happy with. And we also play tested the book in that we had a fairly large number of people read through the book, comment on the book, and be like, oh, you should add this, or oh, I had a question about that, or oh, how does that work? So it was a lot of fun to be able to take everything that I learned from quality assurance, from the good but failure of running my own game studio and apply it. And I'm actually holding a physical proof of my work in my hands. And that feeling is amazing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And is there, again, because writing a book, I'm sure everybody's heard it at least once, how difficult that is. Is there any keys that you can give us into, like, what would you recommend somebody who's looking at, putting his or her ideas down into paper, into something that is going to be quote unquote like a bit more permanent, or a bit more, as you said, like holding that book in your hands, which means such a different thing?
Just do it. Just sit down and do it, because it's never going to exist if you don't put pen to paper. And I actually have a funny story about that, because of course, looking at a blank page can be absolutely terrifying. You just look at it and you're like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not a real author. A whole lot of imposter syndrome comes up. And that happened to me too. So my co-author, Scott Crabtree, basically gave me a line and said, all right, here's the first line of the book. Can you have as much fun as a platypus at work? This line is terrible, absolutely terrible. You can't do worse than that. So just start writing something better. And I did. And as a nod to that, we actually do have a platypus in the last page of the book, rolling some dice, telling you to game on.
There you go. It's a reference to where it all began, right?
Yep.
That is absolutely fantastic. And about the book, because you're already mentioning it as well, is there a date that we can mention here? I'm not sure if it's going to be before or right after the interview goes live, but do you have a launch date?
Yes, March 16th on Amazon.
There you go. You can find it on Amazon once the interview goes live. If it's after March 16th, because I'm almost sure that's going to be the date where we're going live. But in any case, the date is that one, March 16th. Very, very exciting. I have to say, I did get a peek into that book. I read it. I think it's fantastic. It's a great, especially to get people excited about the topic. I think there is a lot of science. There is a lot of facts there that can be very, very into getting people into this. And especially, like, for example, many of us are sometimes trying to convince somebody or trying to show about somebody the value of these types of solutions and of the use of games in contexts which are outside of entertainment. And I think this book does a fantastic job at that. There is a whole mind-opening situation in this, and I think it can be very helpful for many people as well. So I commend you for that great work, and I'm looking forward to seeing the final look of the book, or at least the first edition when it comes out. And congratulations on that.
Thank you.
So, Kristen, when you are thinking of using a game for work or a game for other situations beyond entertainment, or you're creating it, I don't know, whatever situation you want to put yourself at, do you have any sort of process? How do you, or as well, you had a game design studio as well. How do you go about it? What do you do when you're going to do one of these things? What's your process? What's your system? How do you think about these things to implement them in the real world?
So I think that both games and organizational development have very similar ideas in how to go about making a change or taking an idea and making it real. And in game development, it's the prototype or iteration cycle. And in organizational development, it's usually called participatory action research. So the first thing that you do is generally identify a problem, or in terms of a game, identify an experience that you want to create. Then you, in participative action research, consult with a behavioral scientist. So for games, that would be talking to fellow developers, talking to people who are just subject matter experts of whatever you're interested in. Then you start doing some data gathering and coming up with a preliminary diagnosis, an idea of what's going on, and making sure that you're really basing that on something that's going on around you, collecting a little bit of data, not just being like, oh, I think it's probably that, let's go. You give that feedback then to your client or the people that you're working with to then jointly diagnose what's going on, so that, again, it's not just you coming up with an idea of what's going on. Other people who are impacted get a say in how they see that data playing out. You then come up with a plan together or do joint action planning and decide how to take actions. So again, in terms of making a game, you can be like, all right, so we're going to start by prototyping out what we think is going to be our main game mechanics. So you can work on this part, you can work on this part, you can work on this. We'll come up with a schedule and put it all together. And then one of the most important parts is, after you take action, gather data again on that action and evaluate it. And this is where it becomes a loop, because then you'll take that data and see if there are problems and go back to problem identification. So you can go through many prototypes or many iterations, and every single time you're making it a little bit better, moving it a little bit more towards complete, making a change and seeing exactly how that change plays out.
Absolutely. So that's the iterative process. So there, like, correct me if I'm getting it wrong, but what you're proposing here is that, of course, we have to identify this problem, then go gather some primary, basically data, I think. Maybe it could even be secondary, but you go out and gather data to validate what you're thinking. You communicate this gathering of information to the final, hopefully the final user or the client who is requesting the solution. Validate if what you understand is what this other person is understanding, or this other organization is understanding. And then, of course, set out your plan of whatever it is you're going to do. And then there is a fundamental thing that needs to happen there as well, is another data gathering, and possibly, or almost for sure, at least once, you'll get to have an iteration. Is that correct?
Exactly, yeah.
Fantastic. Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. So, Kristen, is there something that you would say with your experience and your research, all these things that you've been doing and understanding throughout this time, is there something that you would say is sort of, again, I don't want to call it a silver bullet because it definitely is not what I'm looking for, but maybe a best practice, something that a project looking at these strategies will almost definitely at least benefit from?
Yeah, so I would say making sure that you are using some sort of iteration loop or participative action research, and that you are specifically going through each and every step and not skipping any. And of course, astute listeners might say, oh, but that's the exact answer that you gave to the last question. Yes, but I'm sure that you can come up with tons of examples from your own life when everyone agreed that this was a fantastic idea, and of course we should gather data, and of course we should make sure that everyone looks at it and get all the perspectives in the room, and we should jointly decide what we're going to do about it and assign everybody tasks. And yet, even though everyone agrees that this is how we should be doing things, we somehow skip a step, or only go through one loop and go, well, we fixed it, it's done, instead of making as many iterations as time and budget allow.
Absolutely. And in fact, this is a recurring topic that this is a loop that we end up talking about quite often. And there's something key, at least in my opinion, about loops and these iterations. And it has to do a lot as well with the way that startups in general, at least what the fancy words are saying nowadays. And it's about, if you go and get into your cave and build something that is, or it looks or it feels like a final product, and you get, not so good feedback, it's going to be a lot more difficult for you, because even though you are definitely a very smart and incredible designer in what you're doing, you're kind of endearing this a bit more than you would have if it had been, just maybe a prototype, or maybe a very basic, functioning thing that at least could be shown and tested, because you're going to be more attached to it because you spend a lot more time in it. There is that sunk cost fallacy in which, you invested so much time and now you want to try to fix it versus, completely pivoting and saying, well, I'm changing the direction almost drastically because I figured out some new information that I didn't have before. So I think that is, in my opinion, at least, it's one of the keys here, because otherwise it's going to be a lot more difficult to actually go through the iteration. You can go through the motions as well. You can say, well, I followed this process and I went through the motions. I gathered some data, I made some changes, and I gathered some more data and made some more changes. But it doesn't mean that it's going to be successful if you didn't make sure that, all that data that you gathered is somehow incorporated and you gathered sufficient data and you are not just trying to validate what you thought was right, but actually trying to, take a hard look at the results, take a hard look at your experiments and your prototypes and what actually happened with your users. And I'm not saying that's easy. I'm just saying it's super, super important. And I think after what you said, Kristen, it seems that you might agree with me.
Yes, and I will back up that it is not easy. It is hard. It is very hard because you are asking people to look at things that are not done, that are ugly, and to tell you that and to tear them apart. But every single time that you do that, yes, it hurts, but it makes them better. And in the end, you can be so much more proud and so much happier of what you did because you know that it will make an impact because you followed this process and you got that feedback early. And again, although I spoke about participative action research for organizational development and an iteration cycle for games, that doesn't mean that you have to use it for just those things. This is how we wrote a book. This could be how you make a change in your personal life. You can apply this in many different areas.
Absolutely. Absolutely true. Absolutely. I mean, at least I completely agree with what you're saying. And the other thing that I think is difficult, and I you didn't get to touch upon, but I know you'll agree, is that one of the things is that it seems when you get this feedback that it seems that you are setting yourself up to be told that you were wrong. And it kind of is that, but don't take it that way. My recommendation here would be to, have these as assumptions. Don't try to make it as though you got it absolutely right the first time. Even assume that you might not get it right the first time. And that way it's kind of easier to navigate through those maybe a bit murky waters of you get some feedback and it means that some of what you did is actually not going to be perfect.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Big surprise, we're humans.
Yeah, shocking, I know.
So, Kristen, after having a bit of, the feel of what these interviews look like, I know at least you heard Scott and hopefully a couple of more interviews at least of the podcast. Is there somebody that comes to your mind and say, oh, I'd really like to listen to this person answering these types of questions in Professor Game?
Yes, indeed. So I am probably going to butcher her name, and I deeply apologize to her if I do, but Katie Salen Teckenbosch, and she is the co-author of Rules of Play. And that is my personal game book Bible. So I would love to hear her thoughts on everything that you have to ask.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Sounds a very exciting character to have on the podcast. And in that same sense of recommendations, and maybe we already got your answer, what would be a book that you would recommend an audience like this one, some people who are interested in, getting the best out of games and applying it to maybe non-entertainment or things other than entertainment in their lives, work, education, or whatever that may be?
And you're correct. You did indeed also get my recommendation for Rules of Play. I think that, so she and her co-author break down games and what makes them unique and special and exactly how they work and many different ways to look at them in an incredibly readable, incredibly astute way. And anytime that you can deepen your knowledge about what games can do and how they work, you can come up with new ways to use them and better ways to use them. So I think that especially for this audience, that book is an amazing read. Plus, I can also just say, my book. You can always read my book.
Absolutely, absolutely. That one should be right next to your and Scott's book, which we will probably be able to get right after this interview. You can just either click pause or wait for the end, find it, and get it in Amazon for your self-engagers. So in that same sense, after talking about the recommendations, after talking about other people who do great things, what would you say about the great things that you do? What would you say is your superpower, that thing that, distinguishes you maybe from most of other people?
Yeah, so for this, I looked up my Gallup Strengths Finders scores, and my top 5 are strategic, learner, achiever, intellection, and activator. And basically what this means altogether is that I love learning new things. I love finding a creative way to apply these new things. And then I also have a strong drive to get things done. So I'm able to take everything that I learn, come up with an idea of, oh, wouldn't it be awesome if I did this with it? And then actually make that a reality.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And talking still again a bit more about yourself, what would you say? And this is probably one of the most difficult questions of this podcast, according to guest feedback. What would you say is your favorite game?
So I actually have an easy answer for that one, but I will say a caveat. It is not the best game, not by a long shot, but it's my favorite. And my favorite game is Final Fantasy VII. And that's because it was the right game at the right time for me. Before I'd played Final Fantasy VII, I'd played a lot of Nintendo games. So I'd played like Yoshi's Island and Super Mario World and all these games that had very little by the way of story. And so when I went into Final Fantasy VII, I thought that that was about the level of story that a game could tell. Like there's a Mario level, you beat it, you go to the next Mario level. And so when I got out of the very first part of the game and the world literally fell apart to reveal a world larger than I could have imagined, my little mind was blown and I was hooked.
Very, very interesting, very good game as well. Some people might have their opinions, but that's what happens with games and these situations for sure. So thank you for your top and favorite game. Even with that caveat, I'm not sure why you went for that, but I respect it. I think it was a very, very good game. Many people liked it a lot, and
because there are problems with it. And I think even if you love something, you should be able to look at it critically. So like, for example, the active time battle system in it, I liked it well enough, but it's not that interesting. And I remember as a kid having the time to grind up XP. But is that a very engaging loop by itself? Maybe not so much. No, I loved it at the time.
Games have their way of getting in, and they have their ways of keeping us there. And games, I would argue, every game is definitely not for every person, and that is actually a good thing. That's okay. That's good. That's fine. And that makes games actually amazing for some people, and for some people just not to like them. And that's good. That's when you one of the things I like to talk about as well is the importance of designing games for somebody, for that audience, either idealized or the actual audience. If you're creating something, for example, for a company, you're not designing it for everybody in the world. You're designing it for your client and for the people who are going to use it. So keep that in mind and make sure it makes sense for them, not for the company right next to it, not for another company you'd like to work with the company you're working with, or the organization, or the school, or the students you're working with. So that's something that I like to highlight of games, and that I like when games do it correctly. So cheers to that.
Exactly.
Kristen, there seems to be still a few minutes that we have left, and the question that came out in the random set of questions that, of course, made sense for you. I think it's actually, I didn't plan this in advance, but it makes sense with what we've been talking about as well. And this question comes from somebody who's asking if you use some process to understand what are the game mechanics that you use with certain types of players. And it comes in very, very straight from what at least what I mentioned before. What do you think about that? Maybe types of players, I don't know if you use that very much or if you use it in a more general, broad sense. How do you decide on those or understand which are the good game mechanics to use?
Test it, try it out. And if you can, try it out multiple times. So, for example, let's say you are choosing a game to bring into your workplace to help teach soft skills. And you know your organization better than an outsider. You know what will fly and what will not, and what will pique people's interests and what will not. I would say go to your friendly local game store, talk to an expert, get a couple of games, try them out in a game night at home, invite a colleague or two that you're close with if you can, and give it a shot. Because you won't know until you try. And especially if you try with the audience that you are targeting or someone reasonably close to it.
Absolutely. And it loops into
loops.
what we were talking about before, and makes a lot of sense. I completely agree that that's one of the main things that we have to do. And of course, maybe somebody would say, well, but what do you do that first game that you choose? How do you do it? Well, I'd argue common sense. Depends on what you're teaching. If you, or you're trying to show, or what you're trying to understand, if it's, again, as you mentioned, soft skills, something that is related to that. And if you don't know any games in that sense, well, go to your local game store, ask. Somebody will probably be able to help you and test it out. There's even, I don't know where you are, but at least in Madrid, I've seen quite a few board game bars where you can just go there and test out some games. And of course,
there are board game cafes, there are board game bars, there are local game stores in most places. And even if there are not, there are certainly lots of online forums where you can talk to other people who love games and say, hey, here's what I'm looking at. Here's what I want to try and build. Does anyone have an idea?
And there's a very, very friendly community online for these types of recommendations. There's many places you can go. I can recommend you 2 or 3. There's one that I've participated a lot in the past is the Gamification Hub, and on Facebook it's a group. That's one of them. There's a fellow podcaster that has a group called Games, Gamification, and Game-Based Education, or something like that, which is the Board Gaming with Education podcast. That's Dustin Stats. He has a group, and there people are commenting on these things pretty regularly. And I'm sure there's hundreds more. I mean, there's a lot of people out there being able to communicate these things. And I would definitely recommend reaching out. I mean, if you subscribe to my email list as well, I'm giving out recommendations every now and then. I'm talking about articles I'm reading, things I'm taking a look at. You can even reply to that email and ask me a quick question. I mean, I'd be happy to help out if that's within my range and I'm capable of, or to redirect you to somebody else. So please do reach out. I don't know if Kristen is also...
I was going to say exactly same here.
There you go. You also have Kristen and many of the past guests as well.
If anyone has a question, and especially a question about bringing a game into an organization, that is what I'm attempting to do with my doctoral degree. So let me know, and I will do my best to hook you up.
There you go. There you go. So, Kristen, we're mostly running out of time by now, but I don't want to let you go before you give us, your signals as well. If there's any sort of page for the book or anything similar, where we can find you in the world of the internet. If you have any final piece of advice, of course. And then, of course, we will say it's game over.
All right. Yes. So again, the book is going to be on Amazon. All Work and Some Play, Future-Proof Your Career Through Games, authored by myself and Scott Crabtree. And it is also being made available through Happy Brain Science, Scott's company. So you can search that and come up with that. And if anyone wants to know more about Happy Brain Science, I am on the About the Team page. And people can also sign up for their newsletter and get a lovely little Introduction to Happiness package, which includes 2 free ebooks and some other goodies. I personally am probably best contacted through LinkedIn. And again, if anyone has questions, I will do my best to answer.
There you go. All these signals that we just got from Kristen, we will be able to find it as well. If you go to professorgame.com, you type on the search bar, you type Kristen, Kristen, and you will definitely run into this page that I'm talking about, where we'll have the best show notes in the gamification world. Definitely. So thank you very much, Kristen, for, investing this time with the engagers, investing all that time that you invested in your book, because I think that's a very valuable and useful outcome for many, many of the people in the audience and the engagers. However, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over.
All right. Thank you very, very much. I am deeply honored to be able to share this time with you and get to share more conversations with the engagers.
Here you go. Let's do it. Hey, engagers. Thank you for listening to this Professor Game podcast. And I'd like to know, how are you listening to this podcast? If you're doing it through a podcasting app, have you subscribed? Have you rated and reviewed this podcast? Please do so if you haven't. That way, we can reach more engagers like you to achieve our mission of making learning amazing. If you want more instructions, you just have to go to professorgame.com/iTunes, and I will see you there.